It was an unusually warm afternoon in St. Mary Mead, the sort of day that invited leisurely promenades and indulgent conversations over iced tea. The village had been astir with excitement for weeks, for the occasion was none other than the annual Whitcomb Garden Party, hosted at the sprawling yet charming estate of Lady Whitcomb herself. Flower beds were meticulously arranged, ribbons fluttered in the gentle breeze, and the scent of freshly baked scones mingled with the faint fragrance of roses. Villagers strolled about, offering polite compliments and careful smiles, each silently vying to appear the picture of refined civility. Miss Marple, seated near a shaded arbor with a cup of chamomile tea, observed the proceedings with her usual quiet interest. Her small frame, draped in a modest dress of soft lavender, seemed almost to blend with the background, allowing her to watch without drawing notice. She'd learned long ago that the world revealed its secrets not to the loud or the insistent, but to those who listened, who noticed, and who waited. "Good afternoon, Miss Marple," chirped young Emily Crumley, the innkeeper's niece, her hat adorned with an overabundance of daisies. "I do hope you're enjoying the party." Miss Marple inclined her head with a gentle smile. "I am, my dear, though I always find it more interesting to watch than to chatter." Emily tilted her head, slightly puzzled, before skipping away to join a group of gossiping matrons. Miss Marple allowed her attention to wander back to the gathering, noting the subtle dynamics among the guests. There was Mr. Leonard Whitcomb, the host's son, standing with an air of polite boredom, and next to him his fiancée, a young woman named Clarissa, who fluttered between small groups as though anxious that each might think her unobservant. Behind them, Mr. Howard Pritchard, the local solicitor, spoke in measured tones to Mrs. Abernathy, whose haughty expressions suggested a careful guarding of her long-held grievances. It was then that Lady Whitcomb herself emerged from the house, her presence commanding yet warm. She was the kind of hostess who thrived on ceremony, and even the most reluctant guests found themselves bowing to her precise arrangements. She clapped her hands gently, summoning attention, and announced, "Dear friends, it gives me great pleasure to welcome you all to our annual gathering. Do enjoy the gardens, the refreshments, and, most of all, the company of one another." The guests murmured polite responses, their attention shifting to the tables laden with delicate pastries, sandwiches, and a selection of fine teas. Miss Marple noted with faint amusement how the more socially ambitious of the attendees hovered near the most ornate displays, while the quieter villagers contented themselves with gentle smiles and careful small talk. Every gesture, every glance, every tilt of the head was a small note in a symphony of human behavior, one that Miss Marple, for all her gentle exterior, read with remarkable acuity. It was a moment of serene normalcy until a sudden, sharp cry sliced through the hum of polite chatter. Miss Marple turned her gaze toward the source, her eyebrows slightly raised. The cry had come from the far side of the garden, near the ancient yew trees that marked the boundary of Lady Whitcomb's property. Guests began to murmur nervously, and a few hurried toward the sound. Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements deliberate, and made her way toward the commotion with the careful calm of one who has seen the human heart in its many guises and is accustomed to its outbursts. There, sprawled upon the manicured lawn, was the lifeless figure of Mr. Henry Frobisher, the recently retired banker who had moved to St. Mary Mead the previous year. His eyes stared sightlessly at the sky, a thin line of blood tracing the corner of his mouth, and his cane lay discarded a few feet away. Guests recoiled in horror, some gasping, others clutching at the nearest arm of a friend, all unprepared for the sudden rupture of their afternoon idyll. "Oh, heavens!" Lady Whitcomb's voice trembled, though she maintained her composure, rushing forward to the body. "Who could have done such a thing?" The village constable, Mr. Dawkins, pushed through the crowd, his expression grave though his hands fumbled with the notebook he had brought in. Anticipation of minor disturbances rather than murder. "Clear the area, please," he instructed, raising a hand, though the crowd hesitated as whispers began to swirl. Miss Marple, standing just beyond the immediate cluster of onlookers, let her gaze roam over the faces around her. Shock was evident, of course, but beneath it, subtle glimmers of curiosity, relief, and even satisfaction flickered in the eyes of some. Human behavior, she thought, never truly wore a mask. It merely borrowed one briefly before the truth crept through. She noted, for example, that Mrs. Abernathy's lip quivered not in grief but in irritation, while young Emily's expression was more of fascination than horror. Clarissa's grip on Leonard's arm was far firmer than mere surprise demanded. Even Lady Whitcomb herself, despite her poised exterior, cast nervous glances toward the shadowed hedges at the garden's edge, as though expecting something or someone to emerge. Miss Marple's thoughts were quiet but precise. There was, in this tableau, no accidental tragedy. The placement of the body, the absence of a struggle, the precise, almost deliberate angle of the fall, all spoke of intention. The question, as always, was why. As the first tentative steps of investigation began, with Mr. Dawkins taking statements and Lady Whitcomb ushering guests to seats where they could be questioned, Miss Marple allowed herself a small, secretive smile. The village of St. Mary Mead, for all its genteel calm, had secrets, as every village does, and she, patient and unassuming, would uncover them, one careful observation at a time. For now, however, there was only the quiet horror of an afternoon interrupted, and the unmistakable toll of an unseen bell in the heart of the village, marking, in the subtlest way, that a murder had been committed and that the dance of suspicion was about to begin. The day that had begun with polite tea and gentle laughter now hummed with tension, a quiet storm that rippled through the manicured gardens of Lady Whitcomb's estate. Guests sat clustered on wrought-iron chairs, their voices hushed, their expressions carefully arranged to hide, or reveal, their true thoughts. The shock of Henry Frobisher's murder had not yet fully settled, and in its place had emerged the village's most potent and insistent force. Gossip. "It's simply dreadful," whispered Mrs. Abernathy to Mrs. Pritchard, who nodded solemnly, though her eyes betrayed curiosity tinged with relief. "Who would have thought such a thing could happen here, in St. Mary Mead?" Mrs. Abernathy's voice dropped further. "I've always suspected there was something not quite right about Mr. Frobisher. He was always so polite. But politeness can hide anything, can it not?" Mrs. Pritchard's gaze flicked toward the other guests, as if confirming that no one else could hear. "Do you think he had enemies among us? I cannot imagine who would wish him ill." It was, of course, exactly this kind of whispered speculation that Miss Marple found so illuminating. She sat quietly in the shade of the arbor, observing the interlacing glances, the subtle gestures, the nervous tapping of fingers against teacups. Each villager, in their own way, revealed a piece of the social puzzle, the hidden resentments, the concealed desires, the carefully cultivated appearances that often masked darker truths. Young Emily Crumley was particularly vocal. She leaned toward her friend Alice Mayhew, her eyes wide with dramatic fascination. "Did you see how he was lying there?" she whispered. "So still. I mean, it's almost exciting." Alice looked horrified. "Exciting? Emily, how can you say that? He's dead." Emily's lips pressed together in defiance. "I mean, I just never thought anything like this would happen in our village. It's thrilling in a way." Miss Marple noted the girl's morbid fascination, filing it away alongside more subtle, telling behaviors. Thrill, anxiety, and moral curiosity often walked hand in hand, and sometimes led to motives in ways the adults never considered. The village constable, Mr. Dawkins, moved among the guests, clipboard in hand, attempting to corral statements, though he found it increasingly difficult to impose order. "Please, if you witnessed anything at all, tell me now," he urged, though his voice carried the uncertainty of a man more accustomed to misplaced chickens than murderers. One by one, the villagers offered their impressions, many of them contradictory, all of them revealing more about themselves than about the crime. Mr. Howard Pritchard, ever composed and meticulous, suggested that the murder must have been premeditated, citing the lack of struggle and the precise placement of the body. Mrs. Abernathy scoffed, insisting it must have been an act of sudden passion. Miss Marple, listening silently, noted both theories but said nothing, allowing the voices of speculation to swirl around her like wind in autumn leaves. Even the children contributed in their own blunt, honest way. Little Thomas Whitcomb, the host's youngest, tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mummy, why did Mr. Frobisher fall down like that?" Lady Whitcomb, poised and dignified even under strain, knelt beside him. "He's gone to heaven, dear. That's all you need to know for now." Thomas's small face scrunched in confusion. But who did it? The adults exchanged uneasy glances, and Miss Marple's eyes softened. Children, she thought, often noticed the inconsistencies adults tried to hide. Their questions could pierce through pretension in ways polite conversation never could. Meanwhile, Clarissa Whitcomb, Leonard's fiancée, seemed unusually restless. She hovered near the refreshments table, straightening napkins that were already perfectly aligned, and brushing invisible crumbs from the silver tray. Every so often she glanced toward Leonard, who appeared tense and irritated, and then back toward the body. Miss Marple observed these gestures carefully. The faint tightening of her jaw, the quick, darting glances, the minute hesitations in her speech when asked innocent questions. Something, she noted, lay beneath the surface, obscured by the careful veneer of composure. The villagers' speculations grew bolder with every passing moment. "I heard he was planning to leave the village," one woman confided to another, "and that Mr. Pritchard had been arguing with him only yesterday. Perhaps that explains it." Another whispered, "Didn't someone see him near the yew trees with a stranger last week? A man in a dark coat? Very suspicious indeed." Miss Marple filed each fragment away, small threads that, when woven together, might reveal the larger tapestry of motive and opportunity. She understood instinctively that in a village such as St. Mary Mead, no crime occurred in isolation. Every resentment, every past quarrel, every carefully buried secret could ripple outward, culminating in a single, shocking act. Even Lady Whitcomb herself, usually so masterful in directing attention and maintaining order, struggled to control the ebb and flow of suspicion. "Please, everyone, let us not jump to conclusions," she urged, though the slight tremor in her voice betrayed her own unease. By late afternoon, the garden had transformed from a scene of polite festivity into one of quiet tension. Guests huddled in clusters, exchanging theories, watching each other for subtle signs of guilt. Miss Marple, for her part, remained serene, sipping her tea and noting the smallest gestures, the way a hand tightened around a teacup, the fleeting glance toward the trees, the careful avoidance of another's eyes. It was, in every sense, the village revealing itself to her, and she, with her patient observation, understood that this first wave of speculation, though chaotic and often incorrect, was the prelude to the revelations that would inevitably follow. Every whispered accusation, every speculative comment, every visible reaction carried weight, and among them she quietly searched for the truth, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the moment when human nature, ever predictable in its inconsistencies, would reveal the murderer. And so St. Mary Mead, once a haven of polite calm and orderly gardens, had become a theatre of suspicion. The murder of Henry Frobisher had disrupted the delicate balance of village life, and in its wake the ordinary residents of the village displayed extraordinary tendencies: fear, curiosity, resentment, and, above all, the irrepressible urge to speculate. Miss Marple, unobtrusive and yet attentive, understood all too well that the first rumors were merely the first pieces of a much larger puzzle, a puzzle that she alone would slowly, inexorably, unravel. The day after the tragic events at Lady Whitcomb's garden party dawned with a deceptive calm. The sun shone gently over St. Mary Mead, but the village itself seemed to hold its breath. Those who had been present at the murder avoided the subject in public, though their furtive glances and stiff smiles betrayed the undercurrent of unease that now flowed through the streets. Windows were drawn slightly, doors left ajar, as though the houses themselves were anxious witnesses, bracing for the revelation of hidden truths. Miss Marple, as always, moved among the villagers with her characteristic quiet discretion. She called at the small shops, where owners rearranged their shelves as though meticulous organization could stave off disorder in life itself. She spoke briefly with the butcher, noting how his cheerful demeanor now carried a subtle edge of distraction, and with the baker, who had served Henry Frobisher's favorite rolls at the garden party, and whose hands trembled slightly even while kneading dough. Each fragment of human behavior, Miss Marple understood, was a potential clue, small yet significant, revealing more than any confession could. At the scene of the crime, the gardens of Lady Whitcomb were cordoned off with polite ropes, and Mr. Dawkins, the constable, patrolled the perimeter with an air of determined, if somewhat flustered, authority. The body of Henry Frobisher had been removed, leaving only the subtle disturbance of the lawn and the faint impression of where he had fallen. Miss Marple observed the ground closely, noting the angle of the leaves that had been brushed aside, the soil slightly disturbed in an irregular pattern, details the constable and the anxious guests had overlooked entirely. "I still cannot believe it," murmured Mrs. Abernathy to Miss Marple when they happened to meet near the yew trees. Her eyes were wide, her voice sharp with a blend of fear and indignation. A man of his age, so quiet, so respectable, and to think, murdered in broad daylight. Miss Marple inclined her head, her expression gentle. "It is always remarkable, Mrs. Abernathy, how ordinary life can suddenly reveal such extraordinary consequences." She allowed the statement to hang in the air, neither comforting nor alarming, merely observing the subtle shift in Mrs. Abernathy's expression. The constable, meanwhile, had begun his preliminary inquiries. He questioned Lady Whitcomb, who recounted the events of the garden party with painstaking precision, noting the order of guests' arrivals, the arrangement of the tables, and the moment when she first noticed the commotion. He spoke to Leonard Whitcomb, who described his sister-in-law Clarissa's distress and his own futile attempts to restore calm. Each account, though accurate in detail, seemed to Miss Marple to reveal more about the narrator than the deceased. Human nature, after all, often colored recollection with subtle self-interest, unconscious bias, and fear of judgment. Miss Marple's observations were quieter, more penetrating. She noted that Leonard's impatience occasionally betrayed irritation toward his fiancée, suggesting tensions that he carefully masked in conversation. Clarissa, for her part, appeared controlled, though her eyes flickered repeatedly toward the yew trees, and her hands fidgeted with the lace of her gloves when she believed herself unobserved. Mrs. Abernathy, ever conscious of social hierarchy, flitted between careful indignation and discreet curiosity, eager to gauge the reactions of others before voicing her own. It was in these small, almost invisible gestures that Miss Marple discerned the first threads of a pattern. The murder of Henry Frobisher, she surmised, had not been an impulsive act. There was precision in the placement of his body, subtlety in the way he was approached, and a calculated timing that spoke to someone who understood both him and the village intimately. The question of motive, she realized, would require more than surface observation. It would require a deep understanding of human behavior, of jealousy, of resentment, of concealed grievances that simmered quietly beneath polite manners. Later that morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village post office, where gossip circulated with astonishing rapidity. She spoke with Mrs. Price, who had been at the garden party to collect a parcel and had noticed that Mr. Frobisher had seemed distracted during the afternoon. He kept glancing toward the yew trees, Mrs. Price confided, lowering her voice, as if he were expecting someone. I thought it peculiar at the time, but I dismissed it. Miss Marple's eyes brightened slightly, though her expression remained placid. Such a detail, seemingly trivial to others, could be pivotal. Anticipation, fear, and vigilance often preceded conflict. That he had expected someone, she noted, narrowed the possibilities. At the local inn, where many of the villagers gathered for lunch, conversations inevitably returned to the murder. Opinions ranged from outright suspicion of strangers to subtle innuendo about quarrels and past slights. "I saw him with Mr. Pritchard just yesterday," one villager whispered, "and they seemed to be arguing over something. Money, I think. It must be connected." Miss Marple sipped her tea quietly, allowing the voices to mingle in the air, each a thread in the fabric of motive and opportunity. Her mind worked as it always did, not in leaps and jumps, but in the careful accumulation of small, often unnoticed facts. Observing the gestures, listening to the half-formed statements, and noting the contradictions between words and behavior, she began to shape a preliminary understanding of the village's intricate web of relationships. By mid-afternoon, she returned to Lady Whitcomb's estate, where she wandered the gardens alone. The stillness of the yew trees, the faint rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze, and the absence of human interference allowed her to think clearly. She considered the villagers' behavior, the fleeting expressions of anxiety, the gestures of concealment, the patterns of attention, and began to see the outlines of motive. One or more among them, she realized, had harbored resentment toward Henry Frobisher, resentment that was both personal and long-standing. Miss Marple's approach, as always, was deliberate. She made no accusations, offered no suggestions, and never allowed herself to be drawn into hasty conclusions. Instead, she observed, noted, and waited, knowing that the truth, when revealed, would speak in its own time. The villagers, caught up in speculation, failed to see the careful pattern of observation unfolding around them, the quiet mind at work beneath a placid exterior. And so, the early investigation of Henry Frobisher's murder unfolded not in dramatic interrogations or forensic examinations, but in the subtle interplay of observation, deduction, and human nature. Miss Marple, patient and unassuming, collected the threads of motive and behavior, weaving a picture that only she could fully comprehend. The village, meanwhile, buzzed with rumor and conjecture, unaware that the real detective work was happening quietly, invisibly, in plain sight. The first steps of discovery, she knew, were always the most delicate, and St. Mary Mead, with all its quaint charm and concealed tensions, was about to reveal secrets that not even the keenest gossip could predict. By the following morning, the entire village of St. Mary Mead seemed to exist in a state of quiet tension, punctuated by furtive glances and whispered conjecture. The murder of Henry Frobisher was no longer merely a topic of speculation. It had become the dominant reality around which the village arranged itself. The constable, Mr. Dawkins, having conducted initial interviews, was now keen to identify a suspect and close the case with an air of efficiency. The attention of the village, as such things often happen, had quickly settled on one individual, Mr. Howard Pritchard, the local solicitor. To the casual observer, his calm demeanor and close association with Mr. Frobisher made him an unlikely culprit, but the combination of proximity, opportunity, and a hint of tension noted at the garden party led many to suspect him. "I told you, Constable," Mrs. Abernathy muttered to a cluster of ladies outside the post office. "That man has always had a calculating look. Did you see how he spoke with Henry yesterday? Sharp words, if I recall correctly. I wouldn't put it past him." Mrs. Pritchard, who overheard the remark, flushed with embarrassment and hurriedly adjusted her gloves. Now, let's not rush to judgment, she said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying her own curiosity. Miss Marple, meanwhile, walked quietly through the village, observing from a distance. She noted the small gestures that betrayed both guilt and innocence, the faint perspiration on Mr. Pritchard's brow as he answered questions, the subtle tension in his fingers when he clasped them together, and the slight avoidance of eye contact when the topic inevitably returned to the deceased. Yet, as always, she withheld judgment. Human behavior was rarely a single thread. One must consider the tapestry in its entirety. By late morning, Mr. Dawkins had arranged for Mr. Pritchard to be formally questioned at the village hall. The room was small and plainly furnished, with wooden chairs and a long table that seemed almost to exaggerate the gravity of the proceedings. Villagers had gathered outside, craning to hear snippets of conversation and adding their own speculative commentary. "Mr. Pritchard," Dawkins began, "you were observed speaking with Mr. Frobisher at the garden party yesterday. Can you account for your actions?" Howard Pritchard adjusted his spectacles, clearing his throat. "Indeed, Constable. Mr. Frobisher and I discussed a minor dispute over a land document he wished to amend. It was a civil matter, nothing more. We parted amicably, and I left him in good spirits." Miss Marple, observing from the back of the room, noted his posture carefully. His words were calm, precise, and plausible, but his feet tapped nervously beneath the table, a small tell that spoke not necessarily of guilt, but of awareness that every movement was now under scrutiny. The constable's questions were polite but persistent, focusing on opportunity and motive. Neighbors whispered their own interpretations outside, that perhaps Mr. Pritchard had argued too, vehemently, that subtle resentment might have brewed beneath his professional courtesy, that perhaps ambition had driven him to murder. Each theory, though speculative, gained traction among those eager for a clear resolution. Miss Marple, seated quietly in the corner, reflected on the evidence, or rather, the lack of it. There was no witness to an actual act of violence, no weapon recovered, and no tangible forensic clue to implicate anyone definitively. The suspicion of Mr. Pritchard rested entirely upon conjecture and the natural human tendency to blame the nearest figure of authority. Meanwhile, the household staff at Lady Whitcomb's estate contributed further layers to the unfolding drama. Mrs. Tebb, the housekeeper, was certain she had heard raised voices between Mr. Frobisher and a visitor late in the morning. "It was a heated conversation," she confided to Miss Marple, though I could not make out the words. "Still, one might think it was quarrelsome enough to lead to something unfortunate." Miss Marple noted the vagueness of the account, the lack of specificity, and the subtle inclination to embellish. Villagers often added a shade of drama to events, whether consciously or unconsciously, and such distortions could mislead even the most diligent investigator. Leonard Whitcomb, for his part, grew increasingly anxious. He visited the scene of the crime repeatedly, pacing the lawn with his hands behind his back, muttering under his breath. His fiancée, Clarissa, accompanied him dutifully, though she often seemed more intent on observing the reactions of others than on offering comfort. Miss Marple, passing through the garden, noticed the slight stiffening of Leonard's posture whenever his mother spoke of Henry Frobisher, and the fleeting shadow of worry crossing Clarissa's face at moments of intense scrutiny. As the morning progressed into afternoon, the villagers' suspicion crystallized around Mr. Pritchard. The constable, eager for closure, began discussing the possibility of formal charges, encouraged by the villagers' collective judgment. But Miss Marple remained thoughtful, silent and unconvinced. The behavior she had observed, she reflected, was consistent with anxiety under scrutiny rather than proof of murderous intent. The real culprit, she sensed, would be someone whose restraint and outward calm masked far deeper motives. In quiet moments, Miss Marple wandered through the estate's gardens, observing small details the others overlooked. The slight shift of the ground where a foot had pressed too firmly, the subtle brush marks on a rose bush, the faint traces of soil on a pathway not ordinarily walked. These minor details, almost invisible to the untrained eye, hinted at movements and presences that the first wave of suspicion had entirely missed. By evening, the village had settled into a tense rhythm. Conversations buzzed with references to Mr. Pritchard, theories of motive and opportunity, and whispered assurances that justice would soon prevail. The local newspaper had sent a correspondent whose report emphasized the scandal and drama, further cementing the public's attention on the solicitor. Miss Marple, however, remained apart, observing not only the accused but the accusers, the watchers and the watched, the subtle interplay of anxiety, anticipation, and curiosity. The first suspects were always obvious. The real danger, she knew, lay beneath the surface, where carefully hidden motives and long-buried resentments waited to be uncovered. As dusk fell over St. Mary Mead, the village appeared serene once more, the gardens bathed in the amber light of late afternoon. Yet beneath this outward calm, currents of suspicion, fear, and unspoken secrets flowed as strongly as ever. Miss Marple, seated on a small bench beneath the yew trees, allowed herself a faint, knowing smile. The first suspects were in place, and the village's gaze was focused on the wrong figure. But patience, observation, and a careful understanding of human nature would, as always, illuminate the truth. And so, the stage was set. The obvious suspect, Mr. Howard Pritchard, remained under scrutiny, while Miss Marple quietly observed, confident that the real murderer's identity would reveal itself not through conjecture or panic, but through subtle, telling behavior. In St. Mary Mead, appearances could be deceiving, and it was only through the gentle lens of perception, patience, and understanding of human nature that justice would ultimately prevail. The morning following the mounting suspicions of St. Mary Mead was overcast, the sky a uniform grey that seemed to match the mood of the villagers. Conversations were hushed, and even those usually inclined to gossip moved with deliberate care, as though fearful of speaking too freely and revealing more than they intended. Miss Marple, true to form, took her morning walk through the gardens of Lady Whitcomb's estate, not for exercise, but for the clarity of thought that came with solitude and observation. It was there, among the hedgerows and the carefully tended flower beds, that she noticed something small, yet striking. A faint smudge of earth on the edge of the garden path, almost invisible beneath a cluster of fallen rose petals, caught her attention. At first glance, it was an ordinary mark, easily dismissed. Yet Miss Marple, who had long studied the subtleties of human behavior and its consequences in the physical world, recognized it immediately as something out of place. It suggested movement, deliberate movement, away from the main thoroughfare, yet it was slight enough to have escaped all other observers. She crouched gently, her eyes following the line of the smudge. The soil was slightly disturbed in a pattern that indicated careful, almost tentative steps. Whoever had made it had sought to avoid notice, yet their presence here had left a trace, a whisper in the garden that no one else had perceived. Miss Marple considered this quietly, filing it away alongside the behavioral observations she had gathered over the past days. Human beings, she reflected, rarely acted without leaving some subtle evidence behind. An overlooked glance, a tremor in the hand, a faint footprint, or the slight misalignment of a garden stone. These minor details often spoke more truth than words or accusations. As she examined the smudge further, she noted that it seemed to lead toward a small, seldom-used side gate that opened onto the lane behind the estate. The gate itself was usually locked, and few villagers ever passed that way, preferring the main entrance for convenience and appearance. Whoever had taken this path, Miss Marple realized, had intimate knowledge of the property and its habits, an insight that narrowed the field of potential suspects considerably. Returning to the main path, she encountered Mrs. Tebb, the housekeeper, who was collecting garden tools with precise motions that conveyed both competence and anxiety. "Good morning, Miss Marple," she said, pausing with a rake in hand. I trust you are well? The gardeners are quite shaken by all this fuss, and the children, oh, they keep asking questions no one seems able to answer." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "They always notice the truth in small ways, Mrs. Tebb, even when we adults wish to obscure it." Mrs. Tebb looked momentarily startled by the remark, but quickly resumed her task, muttering about the proper placement of garden implements. Miss Marple watched her for a few moments, noting the slight tremor in her fingers and the careful attention to maintaining order. Such precision often masked inner agitation, and Miss Marple considered it alongside her observations of other household staff and villagers. Later that morning, she visited the small village shop, ostensibly to purchase a few household necessities, but in truth to observe the interactions of those who had been at the garden party. Conversations inevitably returned to the murder, and Miss Marple listened attentively. "I don't understand why anyone would want to kill Mr. Frobisher," Mrs. Price said, speaking in low, urgent tones. "He was kind to everyone and so proper, but then again, one never really knows, does one?" Miss Marple nodded slightly, her expression neutral. It is rarely the obvious character of a person that dictates motive, but the small, hidden resentments they inspire or conceal. As she walked back toward Lady Whitcomb's estate, Miss Marple reflected on the various threads she had observed. The anxiety of Leonard and Clarissa, the nervousness of Mr. Pritchard, the whispered speculation of the villagers, and now the subtle disturbance in the garden. Each thread alone might mean little, but together they formed a web of human behavior that, when carefully considered, could reveal the truth. Returning to the estate, she took the less traveled path toward the side gate she had earlier observed. The subtle smudge in the soil was still evident, and she crouched again to examine it more closely. The pattern suggested someone had lingered, perhaps to observe Mr. Frobisher, before retreating swiftly. Miss Marple's mind worked steadily, piecing together the probable sequence of actions, a calculated approach, a deliberate timing, and a retreat designed to leave minimal evidence. The sophistication of the act implied someone calm, observant, and intimately familiar with the rhythms of both Henry Frobisher and the estate itself. Later, during a quiet afternoon tea at her own modest home, Miss Marple reviewed her mental notes. She considered each villager's behavior, each subtle gesture, and now this newly discovered clue. The smudge in the garden was in itself minor and easily overlooked, but when paired with the human observations she had meticulously recorded, it pointed toward a suspect who had managed to remain outwardly composed while concealing intent. Miss Marple knew that this clue would be ignored by the police, dismissed by the villagers, and perhaps even by those directly involved. Yet to her trained eye, it was of profound significance. Small, almost imperceptible details often carried the weight of truth, for in them lay the essence of human action, the unconscious slips, the careful missteps, the traces left by those who believed themselves unnoticed. As evening fell, Miss Marple returned once more to the gardens, her eyes following the side path with renewed attention. The village was quiet, save for the occasional bird's call or the distant murmur of voices from the main street. She crouched beside the faint soil disturbance one last time, noting its alignment with the gate and its proximity to the rose beds. Whoever had passed this way had been careful, yes, but not careful enough to erase every trace. Miss Marple allowed herself a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The first truly tangible clue had presented itself. It was subtle, minor, and easily dismissed by those without patience or perception. But it was enough to illuminate a path forward, a path that would, in due course, lead her closer to the truth behind Henry Frobisher's untimely death. She rose, brushing her hands lightly on her skirt, and walked back toward her own home. The village might continue to speculate, and the first suspects might be pursued with zeal. Yet Miss Marple understood that the hidden clue, the almost invisible smudge in the soil, unnoticed by all but herself, was the key that would unlock the deeper mystery, the quiet thread that connected motive, opportunity, and the subtleties of human behavior. And so, with patience as her guide, she prepared to observe more closely, listen more intently, and allow the village to reveal itself in ways that were subtle, intricate, and ultimately decisive. By mid-morning, St. Mary Mead had become a village of quiet tensions and uneasy glances. The murder of Henry Frobisher, once a distant shock, had begun to unravel the carefully maintained facades of civility that so many villagers relied upon. Where once polite conversation had prevailed, now subtle accusations and cautious probing glimmered beneath each word. Miss Marple, as always, moved with deliberate composure, aware that observation at this stage was far more revealing than direct inquiry. She visited Lady Whitcomb's estate under the pretext of discussing arrangements for a forthcoming charity event, yet her attention was wholly absorbed by the undercurrents of the household. Housemaids flitted nervously about, gardeners paused mid-task, and even the usually imperturbable Lady Whitcomb betrayed the faintest flicker of tension when speaking of her deceased guest. It was the servants who first provided insight into the hidden dynamics at play. Mrs. Tebb, the housekeeper, confided quietly to Miss Marple while arranging the dining room. "I shouldn't say, but I noticed Leonard and Mr. Pritchard in a rather heated discussion the day before the party. And then there's Clarissa. She seems nervous, almost fearful of something no one knows. It makes one wonder what she might be hiding." Miss Marple inclined her head thoughtfully. Subtle tensions, particularly among the younger residents, often concealed more than adult arguments or disagreements could reveal. Leonard's impatience and Clarissa's anxiety were not merely reactions to the tragedy. They were fragments of human behavior revealing hidden motives. Later, during a stroll through the village, she observed a small gathering of villagers near the post office. Mrs. Abernathy and several others were exchanging theories, each layer of gossip entwined with insinuations about past grievances. "I always suspected Mr. Frobisher was not as generous as he seemed," Mrs. Abernathy declared. "A man like him surely created enemies without even trying." Emily Crumley, the innkeeper's niece, chimed in, her voice pitched with excitement. "I heard Mr. Pritchard was worried about a business arrangement gone wrong. Perhaps that's why he—" Miss Marple intercepted the conversation with gentle interjection. But do be careful not to mistake speculation for certainty. People often reveal what they most fear or desire when they speak too quickly." Her words drew the children's attention, and Emily, frowning slightly, fell silent. Miss Marple knew the young often observed the truth more keenly than adults, but they could be easily influenced by leading questions and overheard assumptions. By late morning, she received an invitation from Lady Whitcomb to join a small gathering of key village figures, ostensibly to discuss arrangements for Mr. Frobisher's memorial service. The room, though elegantly appointed, carried an undercurrent of tension. Each attendee had something to conceal, or feared they did. Miss Marple, quietly seated, allowed her eyes to roam, noting the subtle cues: Mrs. Abernathy's tight clasp of her hands, Leonard's restless shifting in his chair, Clarissa's frequent glances toward the window, and Mr. Pritchard's careful, controlled manner. The conversation began cautiously. Lady Whitcomb attempted to maintain decorum, speaking of flowers, the memorial arrangements, and proper etiquette. Yet, inevitably, past grievances emerged, thinly veiled under polite language. "I do hope the memorial is conducted properly," Mrs. Abernathy said, her tone polite but laden with accusation. "A man of Mr. Frobisher's standing deserves dignity, though one wonders if dignity was always reciprocated in the village." This prompted an audible stir. Leonard's brow furrowed, and Clarissa's hand trembled slightly as she reached for a teacup. Miss Marple noted each gesture with care, the subtle tension, the fleeting expressions, the minute hesitations. Every reaction was a piece of the puzzle. Howard Pritchard, maintaining composure, responded with measured words. It is our duty to respect the memory of the deceased and to ensure all arrangements are handled correctly. Personal feelings should not interfere. Miss Marple allowed herself a quiet observation. Mr. Pritchard's words were precise, calm and rational, yet there was a tension behind his eyes, a careful control that suggested he was aware of scrutiny, aware that the village's gaze could be as piercing as any legal inquiry. Gradually, the conversation turned to more personal matters. Mrs. Abernathy, unable to resist probing, asked, "And what of Leonard's argument with Mr. Frobisher the week before the garden party? Surely some disagreement preceded this tragic outcome." Leonard's jaw tightened. It was a minor misunderstanding regarding the sale of a parcel of land. "It required no discussion here," he replied, though the force of his words suggested otherwise. Clarissa's hand hovered near his arm, as if to steady him, though her own unease was evident. Miss Marple observed quietly, noting the micro-expressions. Leonard's brief scowl, the flicker of worry in Clarissa's eyes, and the subtle rigidness of Mr. Pritchard's posture. Each was a clue not to the act itself, but to the pressures, fears, and resentments that had been simmering beneath polite appearances. Later, outside the gathering, Miss Marple took a brief walk to the side garden. She reflected on the patterns she had observed, the hidden anxieties, the whispered threats, the long-standing grievances and minor jealousies that, when combined, created a web capable of sustaining the weight of a motive. In small villages such as St. Mary Mead, the past never truly stayed buried. It simply waited for the right moment and the right opportunity to surface. It was here that Miss Marple realized the murder had roots far deeper than a single quarrel or a fleeting argument. Hidden connections, old slights, and minor injustices compounded, over years had formed a lattice of human emotion, one that could tip even the most restrained individual into desperation. Each villager, she noted, carried some fragment of tension, some concealed secret, and any one of them could have contributed to the fateful outcome under the right circumstances. Returning indoors, she observed a quiet exchange between Clarissa and Mrs. Tebb. The housekeeper's eyes were sharp, and Clarissa's lips were pressed tightly together. Their conversation, though seemingly innocuous, contained the nuances of caution, discretion, and perhaps even fear. Miss Marple filed this carefully alongside her other observations, knowing that the interplay between household staff and family members often revealed what direct inquiry could not. As the afternoon wore on, the village settled into a fragile rhythm, with guests departing for their own homes and Mrs. Abernathy still murmuring conjectures to anyone who would listen. Miss Marple, however, remained untroubled by the chaos. In her mind, the hidden patterns were becoming clearer. The clues were subtle, often overlooked, and deeply entwined with the secrets of human relationships. Patience, she reminded herself, was essential. Human behavior, once understood, revealed its truth gradually. In time, each secret would come to light, not by force, but by the careful observation of those attuned to its subtleties. And Miss Marple, quietly assured herself, was exactly that sort of observer. The next morning, St. Mary Mead awoke to an unsettling rumor that spread faster than the morning mist over the fields. A second, seemingly unrelated incident had occurred at the village inn. A guest, Mr. Alfred Bevan, a distant cousin of the deceased, had suffered a fainting spell so severe that the doctor had been called in haste. Initial reports suggested it was simply a reaction to shock, yet the villagers whispered in hushed tones about foul play. Miss Marple, upon hearing the news, adjusted her shawl and set out toward the inn with measured steps. Her mind worked quietly, connecting the various threads she had observed over the past days. The initial murder of Henry Frobisher, the behaviors of Leonard, Clarissa, Mr. Pritchard, and now the sudden collapse of Mr. Bevan. Though outwardly unrelated, the incident suggested the presence of anxiety, fear, or perhaps a more deliberate attempt to unsettle those connected to the original crime. Arriving at the inn, Miss Marple found the atmosphere charged with concern and curiosity. Mr. Bevan lay in a guest room, attended by the village doctor, while the innkeeper hovered anxiously nearby. Villagers lingered in the common room, speaking in low tones, each eager to be seen as in possession of a crucial insight. "Miss Marple, you've heard, of course?" said Mrs. Price, her voice quivering with both excitement and apprehension. Mr. Bevan, he nearly collapsed. Some say it was fright, others say— She hesitated, glancing around as if the mere suggestion of malice was dangerous to utter aloud. Miss Marple inclined her head gently. "It is difficult to judge without knowing all the circumstances, Mrs. Price. Yet one must always consider the possibility that events may be connected, even when they appear separate." The doctor, a methodical man with a penchant for understatement, emerged from the guest room. "Nothing physically alarming," he said in a neutral tone. "He is simply overtaxed, emotionally distressed. A fainting spell, nothing more. Still, caution is advised." Miss Marple noted the doctor's careful avoidance of speculation and, as always, she observed not only the patient's condition, but the reactions of those around him. Mr. Bevan's hands trembled slightly, his eyes flicked nervously toward the innkeeper, and there was a faint sheen of perspiration along his brow. These were the subtle signatures of fear, of anticipation, of anxiety, and they spoke more than words could. Outside the inn, Leonard Whitcomb paced with a restless energy, accompanied by Clarissa. The tension between them was palpable, though carefully controlled. Leonard's voice carried faintly to Miss Marple's ears. "It's preposterous, Clarissa. Another incident just like that. It must be coincidence." Clarissa, her fingers nervously twisting a handkerchief, responded softly, "Coincidence, perhaps. But one cannot ignore the possibility. Two events so closely following one another." Miss Marple, noting their behavior, considered the possibility of deliberate manipulation. Whoever was responsible for Henry Frobisher's murder may have had reason to create fear, to unsettle the family and those connected to the estate. The second incident could serve as a diversion, a means of drawing attention away from the real culprit or revealing reactions that might betray knowledge of guilt. Inside the inn, subtle details caught her attention. A chair had been slightly moved, not by accident, but as if someone had positioned it to monitor the room. The placement of a glass of water near the bedside seemed deliberate, a small comfort offered to calm nerves, but also a potential test of the guest's composure. Miss Marple noted these minor cues with quiet appreciation, understanding that behavior, even in mundane tasks, could illuminate character and motive. By mid-afternoon, the villagers' attention was split, half focused on Mr. Bevan's condition, while the other half continued to speculate about Mr. Pritchard's role in the original murder. The constable, caught between two incidents, attempted to maintain order but showed signs of strain. His repeated inquiries were polite but increasingly desperate for a clear direction. Miss Marple, observing quietly from a corner, reflected on the pattern emerging. The first murder had occurred at a public event, drawing attention and emotion. The second incident, though non-lethal, created anxiety and uncertainty, testing the reactions of those connected to the deceased. Such orchestration required foresight, knowledge of human behavior, and the ability to predict how individuals would respond under pressure. It became increasingly apparent to her that the real culprit was calculating and deliberate. The superficial suspicion placed upon Mr. Pritchard was, in Miss Marple's assessment, exactly the type of diversion that would benefit someone attempting to conceal deeper motives. Villagers, consumed by speculation, had become unwitting instruments in the perpetrator's plan. Later, she visited the side garden at Lady Whitcomb's estate. The faint soil smudge she had noticed days before now seemed more significant in light of the second incident. The subtle path away from the main thoroughfare, the carefully chosen moment to approach, and the intimate knowledge of the estate all suggested someone deeply familiar with the rhythms and habits of the household. The second incident only reinforced her initial suspicion that the outwardly obvious suspects were being misled by appearances. Miss Marple then reflected on the subtle psychological effect of the second event. Fear, she noted, was a powerful tool. It could manipulate attention, induce confession, or reveal hidden truths in the reactions of others. Mr. Bevan's fainting, though physically inconsequential, provided a window into the fears and anxieties of those around him, a window the real culprit had deliberately opened. By evening, the village was abuzz with theories. Mrs. Abernathy declared to anyone who would listen, "Two incidents in such short succession cannot be unrelated. I knew there were forces at work beyond our comprehension." Leonard and Clarissa, meanwhile, were quieter, each caught in private apprehension. Leonard's agitation had grown sharper, and Clarissa's careful composure began to falter under repeated questioning from villagers and well-meaning friends. Miss Marple, observing from a distance, noted the signs of strain, recognizing them as subtle indicators of knowledge, guilt, or complicity, though she withheld judgment, knowing appearances were often deceptive. That evening, as dusk settled over St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple returned to her own home, quietly contemplating the implications of the day. Two incidents, she realized, were not random. They were a carefully orchestrated series of events designed to provoke, to mislead, and to expose. The second crime was a psychological mirror of the first, revealing vulnerabilities in both the village and the household. Sitting in her familiar armchair, Miss Marple reflected on what she had observed. The overt suspicion of Mr. Pritchard, the anxiety of Leonard and Clarissa, the subtle reactions of the innkeeper and villagers, all were threads in a larger tapestry. The real culprit, she understood, had orchestrated events to manipulate attention, to divert suspicion, and to test the reactions of others. And as always, she trusted patience and observation over haste. The puzzle was unfolding according to a pattern only she could perceive, and the deeper truth lay hidden just beneath the surface, waiting for the moment when it would reveal itself with clarity. St. Mary Mead, once peaceful and orderly, now simmered with fear, curiosity, and misdirection. The real murderer remained unseen, their presence masked by careful deception and subtle influence. But Miss Marple, with her patient attention to human nature and unnoticed gestures, felt the first glimmers of understanding. A twist, indeed, had shifted the narrative. But in that shift, the key to the entire mystery now lay within reach. The evening settled over St. Mary Mead with a peculiar hush, the kind that presages revelation. The streets, usually dotted with the cheerful chatter of villagers returning from daily errands, were quiet, and the few lanterns flickering along the lanes seemed to cast longer shadows than usual. Miss Marple, sipping her evening tea, allowed herself a moment of quiet reflection. Days of observation had furnished her with a detailed understanding of each individual's patterns, motivations, and subtle inclinations. It was now time for a more direct approach, a final, delicate test to observe the reactions that mere conversation could provoke. She invited Leonard Whitcomb and Clarissa to her modest sitting room, ostensibly to offer comfort and guidance. They arrived promptly, Leonard with a restless energy that barely concealed his agitation, and Clarissa with a composure that wavered beneath the strain of days of speculation and fear. Miss Marple greeted them with her usual gentle warmth, though beneath her calm demeanor, her mind was alert, measuring each micro-expression, every fleeting glance, every subtle shift in posture. "Tea, my dears?" she asked, pouring the steaming liquid into delicate china cups. "You must be weary from all the excitement. It is a great shock, of course, when someone dear departs so suddenly." Leonard nodded stiffly, accepting the cup with hands that trembled slightly. Clarissa, seated beside him, offered only a polite smile, her fingers intertwined nervously on her lap. Miss Marple's eyes, however, were fixed on them with a quiet intensity. She began to speak in a gentle, almost meandering manner, discussing the events of the past week, referencing the garden party, the subtle disturbances, and the behavior of various villagers. Yet her words were carefully chosen. Each sentence was a probe, designed to elicit reactions rather than provide information. "You know," she remarked lightly, "it is remarkable how people reveal themselves when under pressure, even when they think no one is observing. A careless glance, a tightening of the hand, a slight hesitation, such things speak volumes." Leonard shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening, while Clarissa's hand, previously resting calmly on her lap, clenched imperceptibly for a moment before she relaxed again. Miss Marple noted these gestures with the quiet satisfaction of one confirming an emerging pattern. She continued, weaving observations into a conversational narrative, recounting the strange fainting of Mr. Bevan and the minor disturbances in the garden. Her tone was conversational, devoid of accusation, yet layered with subtle implication. "I often think," she said softly, "that the smallest gestures, the things people assume we do not notice, are the truest indicators of character. Even a perfectly composed person can reveal much if one knows what to look for." Leonard's face tightened further, and his eyes flicked nervously toward the window, as if imagining invisible observers outside. Clarissa's lips pressed together, and she made a brief, hesitant movement, almost as if she considered speaking but thought better of it. Miss Marple, noting the brief lapse in control, filed it away. "Do you recall, my dears," Miss Marple continued, "how Mr. Frobisher and others were seated in the garden, each with their own small concerns and preoccupations? One might think such details trivial, yet in truth they matter immensely. They can reveal intentions, anxieties, even guilt." Leonard shifted once more, his restless energy now visibly increasing. Clarissa, whose hands were clasped tightly around her teacup, took care not to meet Miss Marple's eyes directly. The detective's gaze, calm yet piercing, swept over them both, noting the telltale signs of unease that her conversational probes had provoked. Miss Marple allowed a pause to settle the room, creating a deliberate space in which reactions could surface. She spoke softly, almost innocuously. "It is fascinating how the mind recalls certain details. The way a path is disturbed in a garden, or a hand trembles slightly when faced with unexpected news. Some think these things are insignificant, but they are often the very keys that unlock understanding." At this, Leonard's eyes flickered sharply, and he set his teacup down with a slightly louder clink than necessary. Clarissa, sitting beside him, suddenly became rigid, her knuckles whitening around the delicate china. Miss Marple's gaze softened, but her mind recorded every minute gesture, the subtle signs of guilt, anxiety, and the tension that came not from fear of the law, but from fear of being observed and understood. "Of course," she continued, smiling faintly, "one can always misinterpret signs, and assumptions can be misleading. Yet when multiple observations align, an anxious glance, a sudden hesitation, a restless shift, they form a pattern that rarely deceives." It was then, in the delicate quiet, that Miss Marple decided to introduce a more pointed probe. She mentioned casually, as though recalling an anecdote, the faint smudge she had discovered in the side garden days earlier. "I noticed," she said lightly, "a small disturbance near the gate, easily overlooked. Most people would have missed it, but it seemed meaningful. The person who left it knew the estate well and perhaps wished to ensure their presence was noted, subtly." Leonard's hand clenched involuntarily under the table, and Clarissa's breath caught for a moment. Miss Marple's eyes, soft yet unwavering, caught the fleeting tremor and the suppressed reaction. She said nothing further, allowing silence to amplify the effect of her words. In the quiet, the truth hovered just beneath the surface, waiting for someone to betray themselves without realizing it. The mind, Miss Marple continued, sometimes reveals what the lips would deny. One cannot always conceal everything, no matter how carefully rehearsed the story. The smallest clue, the quietest gesture, they are often the most revealing. Leonard, unable to maintain composure, shifted again, a subtle flush rising on his cheeks. Clarissa's eyes darted away, avoiding direct contact with Miss Marple, betraying an anxiety she had not previously allowed to surface. The patterns Miss Marple had been observing for days, the subtle indications of knowledge, involvement, or at least complicity, were now emerging in real time, confirming her suspicions. Miss Marple sipped her tea, allowing the room to remain in silence, the tension palpable yet unspoken. In that space, the reactions of Leonard and Clarissa had spoken volumes more than any direct accusation could. She did not yet need confession. The psychological test had revealed the cracks in their composed facades. By the time the evening shadows deepened and the first stars began to appear, Miss Marple had gathered everything she needed. The final test had worked. The true nature of their involvement was subtly, yet unmistakably, revealed through their reactions, gestures, and fleeting expressions. And as the door closed behind her guests, she leaned back in her chair, quietly contemplating the final steps that would soon bring the entire puzzle into clarity. Patience, perception, and the quiet understanding of human behavior had brought her to this moment. The following morning, the village of St. Mary Mead seemed quieter than usual, the sun casting a gentle golden light over the cobbled streets and the neat gardens. Villagers moved about with the faint tension of people awaiting a conclusion they could neither fully articulate nor control. Miss Marple, for her part, had risen early, her mind methodically tracing the intricate web of observation, suspicion, and subtle evidence she had carefully assembled over the past week. She had invited the key villagers to gather at Lady Whitcomb's estate under the pretense of a routine discussion about arrangements for Mr. Frobisher's memorial. In truth, she intended to lay bare the truths hidden beneath layers of deceit, hesitation, and carefully crafted appearances. Each invited guest arrived with their own anxieties, some hidden beneath forced politeness, others more transparent in restless glances or nervous gestures. Miss Marple began with a gentle tone, the kind that belied the seriousness of her forthcoming revelations. "Thank you all for joining me today," she said softly, "to discuss arrangements for Mr. Frobisher. Yet I cannot help but reflect that in St. Mary Mead, no event is ever as simple as it appears." The assembled group shifted uneasily. Leonard Whitcomb, Clarissa, Mr. Pritchard, Mrs. Abernathy, and even the housekeeper, Mrs. Tebb, were each present, their expressions a careful balance of curiosity and apprehension. Miss Marple continued, her voice calm, inviting reflection rather than accusation. "Henry Frobisher," she said, "was a man whose kindness was often admired, yet who, like all of us, had an impact on those around him. Some of that impact was beneficial, and some less so. When he passed, it brought forth not only grief, but also the subtle truths we may wish to conceal." Her words drew the attention of all present. Mrs. Abernathy shifted in her chair, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Leonard's fingers twitched imperceptibly, while Clarissa's eyes, previously composed, now betrayed faint tension. Mr. Pritchard, always so deliberate, leaned forward slightly, a signal that he was absorbing each nuance with care. Miss Marple spoke of the events at the garden party first, recounting the sequence of social interactions, the timing of conversations, and the behaviors she had observed. Her tone remained gentle, yet each detail was chosen carefully to evoke reflection among the villagers. "At first glance," she continued, "one might suspect Mr. Pritchard, whose interactions with Henry were not always without friction. Yet appearances are not always the truth, and suspicion must be tempered with careful observation." She paused, allowing her audience to digest the statement before moving on to the faint smudge in the garden. It was in the side garden, near the seldom-used gate, that I noticed a subtle trace, easily overlooked, yet telling in its implications. The person who created it moved with knowledge and deliberation, aware of the household's routines, and careful to leave only the slightest evidence. Leonard's fingers clenched around his teacup, a faint flush rising on his cheeks. Clarissa shifted, glancing nervously at him. Miss Marple's eyes softened, yet her focus remained unwavering. Many might have missed this small clue, but human behavior often leaves a record. Gestures, hesitation, anxiety, these are as revealing as any physical evidence. She then turned her attention to the second incident, the fainting of Mr. Bevan at the village inn. That event, while seemingly minor, was orchestrated to provoke a reaction, to reveal the concealed anxieties of those involved. It was not a mere accident, nor an unrelated event, but a test, a psychological probe. Her voice, calm yet precise, guided the villagers to connect the dots. Who benefits from these disturbances, and whose reactions align with the patterns we have observed? The anxiety, the hesitation, the careful concealment of knowledge, they point not to coincidence, but to deliberation. Miss Marple rose slowly, her movements deliberate. She addressed Leonard directly, her gaze gentle yet unyielding. "Leonard, I observed you closely over the past days. Your agitation, your restless energy, and the subtle tensions shared with Clarissa revealed more than words ever could. Yet, even more telling were your gestures during the discussion at my home. The hands, the glance, the momentary falter of composure. It spoke of knowledge withheld, of careful concealment, and of a desire to control the narrative." Leonard's jaw tightened, but he did not speak. Clarissa, beside him, now showed visible tension, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Miss Marple's voice remained calm, yet each word was precise. "And Clarissa," she continued, "your careful composure, while admirable, was equally revealing. The anxiety you sought to hide, the subtle signals of unease during the psychological probes, confirmed that the orchestrated events had an intended purpose: to test your reactions, to observe what you would reveal under subtle pressure." The room fell into a tense silence, each villager absorbing the precision of Miss Marple's observations. She moved toward the window, gesturing subtly toward the side garden. The smudge in the garden, the fainting at the inn, the carefully calculated actions, all were designed by a mind familiar with human nature, with the vulnerabilities that lie beneath even the most composed exterior. She turned her gaze back to Leonard and Clarissa. The murderer was not the one whose behavior was outwardly suspicious, but the one whose careful orchestration of events revealed knowledge that could not have been acquired innocently. The faint disturbance in the garden, unnoticed by all but a careful observer, pointed directly to those intimately involved in the estate's rhythms. Leonard finally spoke, his voice tense. "You think we—" Miss Marple's expression softened. "I do not think, Leonard. I know. The careful concealment, the subtle manipulation, and the reactions to psychological pressure, all evidence align to reveal the truth. It was you and Clarissa, acting together, whose knowledge of the household allowed you to orchestrate the events that led to Henry Frobisher's death." A collective gasp rose from the villagers. Mrs. Abernathy clutched her pearls, and even the constable shifted uneasily, his face betraying both relief and disbelief. Leonard's head sank slightly, while Clarissa's lips parted in a faint gasp, a single tear glistening in her eye. Miss Marple's voice remained gentle, almost maternal. The motive, as subtle as the means, lay in resentment, perceived slight, and the desire to control circumstances beyond your reach. The garden, the inn, the reactions, all pieces of a carefully constructed puzzle, now fully revealed. And in that quiet moment, the intricate lattice of human behavior, observation and subtle evidence fell into place. The villagers, though shocked, understood at last the precision with which Miss Marple had unraveled the hidden truths of St. Mary Mead. The following days in St. Mary Mead carried an air of cautious restoration. The murder of Henry Frobisher, the subtle disturbances, and the revelation of Leonard and Clarissa's involvement had left their mark on the village, yet life, as it always does, began to settle into a new rhythm. Shops reopened with polite greetings, the church bells rang in their customary cadence, and villagers returned to their routines, though a faint unease lingered beneath the veneer of normalcy. Miss Marple, sitting quietly in her own parlour, reflected on the events with the calm composure that had always been her hallmark. The truth, as it had been uncovered, was both satisfying and disquieting. Satisfying in the sense that the carefully hidden threads of human behavior had been read and understood, disquieting because she knew that even in seemingly tranquil villages, the depths of human passion, resentment, and ambition could erupt when least expected. Lady Whitcomb's estate, once a scene of polite gatherings and orderly gardens, now bore the subtle weight of tension. The Whitcomb household had been deeply affected by Leonard's betrayal. Conversations among the staff were quieter, punctuated by glances and the faint rustle of whispered speculation. Mrs. Tebb, the housekeeper, maintained her dignity while quietly mourning the breach of trust. "It is remarkable," she confided to Miss Marple one afternoon, "how quickly one's own family can conceal and yet betray their intentions." Miss Marple nodded, her sharp eyes softening as she considered the layers of human complexity she had observed. "It is often not malice alone that drives such actions, Mrs. Tebb," she said gently, "but fear, pride, and the subtle desire to maintain control. These are qualities every human shares, though they manifest in ways both visible and hidden." Leonard and Clarissa, meanwhile, had been removed from positions of responsibility within the estate, and their social presence in the village diminished. Leonard's once confident stride had become cautious, and Clarissa's serene composure was replaced with careful vigilance, a constant awareness of the subtle judgments cast by neighbours. Even so, Miss Marple noted, the pair retained their dignity, each navigating the consequences of their actions with varying degrees of grace and remorse. In the village square, conversations slowly returned to ordinary matters. Mrs. Abernathy could be heard discussing the best way to prune roses, and the shopkeepers exchanged news of deliveries and minor disputes with a renewed sense of routine. Yet, beneath these everyday exchanges, there lingered a tacit acknowledgment of the events that had shaken the community, a shared understanding that appearances could deceive, and that even the most familiar faces could harbor secrets. The inn, too, resumed its customary liveliness. Mr. Bevan, now fully recovered from his fainting episode, returned to the common room, greeted with both relief and polite curiosity. Conversations about the previous incidents were careful and measured, tempered by an understanding that the village had been irrevocably altered. Yet the innkeeper observed, with satisfaction, that the community's cohesion remained intact, strengthened perhaps by the shared experience of adversity and revelation. Miss Marple, in her walks through the village, noted the subtle changes in behavior among her neighbours. There was an increased attentiveness in conversations, a quieter regard for the reactions of others, and a heightened awareness of the consequences that even minor actions could entail. Children played with a renewed sense of caution, their games reflecting the careful observation of the adults around them. Even the church bells, though ringing in their customary patterns, seemed to carry a resonance of remembrance for events that had unfolded so quietly, yet so dramatically. During one afternoon visit to Lady Whitcomb, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the human tendency to conceal motives and feelings. The household, though calm, retained the faint echo of unease. Lady Whitcomb herself, a figure of patience and propriety, spoke with quiet admiration of Miss Marple's skill. "You have a remarkable understanding of people," she said softly, "a gift for noticing what others overlook." Miss Marple, with her usual modesty, replied, "It is not so much a gift as a habit, Lady Whitcomb. Years of observing human nature in all its variety teaches one to perceive what is often left unspoken. People reveal their truths in small gestures, in fleeting expressions, in the subtleties of behavior." The constable, too, found relief in the resolution of the case. With Leonard and Clarissa's culpability confirmed, the minor disturbances and the resulting investigation no longer clouded his work. He moved through the village with renewed efficiency, though with a quiet acknowledgement of the lessons imparted by the subtlety of human deception and the precision of Miss Marple's insights. As the days passed, Miss Marple allowed herself to contemplate the broader implications of the events. The murder, while shocking, was ultimately a reflection of human nature, the complex interplay of pride, resentment, fear, and desire. The orchestration of events, the careful manipulation of appearances, and the subtle psychological tests had all served to reveal what was hidden. And in that revelation, the village had learned, once more, that understanding human behavior was often more crucial than any physical evidence. By the end of the week, St. Mary Mead had resumed a semblance of tranquility. The gardens bloomed, the streets carried the gentle hum of daily life, and the familiar rhythms of village existence reasserted themselves. Yet, for those who had been closely involved, the memory of events lingered, a reminder that beneath the placid surface of any community, complexities and tensions remained, waiting for circumstances that could expose them. Miss Marple, seated in her favorite chair with a cup of tea, allowed herself a small smile. The village had returned to its outwardly peaceful routine, but the truth, the understanding of human nature, remained firmly in her mind. She reflected, as she often did, on the subtle interplay of behavior, the quiet signals, and the patterns that revealed motives. In her hands, the threads of human nature had been carefully observed, understood, and gently unraveled. As dusk fell over the village, the last rays of sunlight glinting across the hedgerows, Miss Marple felt a quiet satisfaction. Justice had been served, not through confrontation or force, but through patient observation, subtle reasoning, and a deep understanding of the human heart. In St. Mary Mead, life would continue, but beneath its calm surface, the lessons of that fateful week would endure, quietly shaping behavior and awareness for days to come. And Miss Marple, ever composed, continued her work, not as a figure of authority, but as a quiet observer of humanity, attuned to the rhythms, patterns, and secrets that lay just beneath the surface of daily life. The village of St. Mary Mead had settled into a fragile rhythm, though the events of the past fortnight still cast long shadows over familiar streets and gardens. Miss Marple moved through the village with her customary unassuming grace, yet every step, every observation, contributed to the quiet understanding she nurtured of her neighbors' hearts and minds. It was in these moments, when life seemed calm and routine, that she often discerned the subtleties others overlooked, the lingering tremor of guilt, the faint relief of the innocent, and the undercurrents of human behavior that would forever shape the village's quiet social tapestry. Lady Whitcomb's estate, once a site of scandalous revelation, had regained a sense of order. Yet even amidst the tidy hedgerows and polished halls, the impact of Leonard and Clarissa's actions lingered. The household staff, while performing their duties with renewed efficiency, carried an unspoken awareness of the fragility of appearances. Mrs. Tebb, the housekeeper, spoke to Miss Marple one morning with a quiet admiration and a trace of lingering incredulity. "I still cannot fathom how you discerned so much from so little," she said, arranging silverware with meticulous care. "Even the subtle tremor of a hand, or a glance not meant to be noticed, how can one see such things so clearly?" Miss Marple smiled gently, her eyes reflecting the calm certainty that had guided her throughout the investigation. "It is not a matter of seeing what is unusual, Mrs. Tebb, but noticing what is ordinary and observing the slight ways in which it can change under pressure," she replied softly. "People reveal themselves constantly, even when they intend to conceal their intentions. One must simply pay careful attention." The constable, though relieved that the case had been resolved without further harm, still found Miss Marple's methods both remarkable and slightly unsettling. He greeted her during one of her morning walks and remarked, "It's extraordinary, Miss Marple, how you pieced everything together. The whole village suspected one thing, yet you, quietly, subtly, knew the truth all along." Miss Marple inclined her head, the faintest smile playing upon her lips. "It is never about suspicion alone, Constable," she said. "It is about observation, patience, and understanding the delicate nuances of human behavior. The truth often resides in the subtleties, the fleeting gestures, and the whispered anxieties that we might otherwise dismiss." Even among the villagers who had been peripheral to the events, the ripple effect was evident. Conversations in the market, once casual and carefree, now carried a touch of caution. Gossip persisted, of course, but with a new layer of awareness, an understanding that appearances could deceive and that the quietest behavior might reveal the deepest truths. Mrs. Abernathy, always eager to discuss matters of local concern, had shifted her tone from speculation to measured reflection. Even she now spoke with a hint of deference when recounting the sequence of events, acknowledging the quiet acuity with which Miss Marple had discerned the hidden motives. In her own home, Miss Marple found solace in reflection. She sat by the window in her familiar armchair, the late autumn sun casting a warm glow over the lace curtains and familiar furnishings. With a cup of tea in hand, she allowed her mind to revisit the intricate tapestry of human behavior she had observed. The tension between Leonard and Clarissa, the subtle testing of reactions, the faint disturbances that revealed so much more than any overt act. Every gesture, every hesitation had contributed to the unmasking of truth. The faint memory of the garden smudge, the orchestrated fainting of Mr. Bevan, and the subtle signs of anxiety that surfaced during her conversations, all were now part of a broader understanding. Human nature, she mused, was both predictable and endlessly complex. People acted according to habit, desire, and fear, yet each acted within the constraints of their knowledge and circumstance. In the quiet of her home, she considered how those lessons might be observed, interpreted, and understood in other villages, other moments, other lives. Lady Whitcomb, aware that life must continue, had begun to host small, polite gatherings again. The memorial for Henry Frobisher was conducted with decorum, yet it carried an undercurrent of introspection. Guests, while mourning, were also keenly aware of the subtle intricacies that had led to the truth being revealed. Miss Marple attended quietly, observing the interplay of grief, relief, and lingering social tension. Every conversation, every courteous exchange added another layer to her understanding of the villagers' character and resilience. Even the younger villagers, who had been largely unaware of the adult machinations, began to show signs of cautious maturity. They sensed, without fully understanding, that human behavior could be deceptive, that appearances were not always reliable, and that trust must be measured. It was, Miss Marple reflected, an important lesson imparted not through direct instruction, but through observation and subtle consequence. In quiet moments, Miss Marple allowed herself to consider Leonard and Clarissa's future. They had been removed from positions of authority and influence within the village, yet she recognized that punishment alone did not encompass the full spectrum of consequence. The experience had exposed the vulnerabilities, the anxieties, and the human tendencies that led to misjudgment and misbehavior. In their own ways, both would carry these lessons forward, whether consciously or unconsciously, as a reminder of the consequences of hidden ambition and deceit. The constable, The villagers, the Whitcomb household, and even Mr. Bevan had all resumed routines. Yet Miss Marple knew the subtle imprint of these events would remain. Like faint echoes in a quiet room, the lessons of observation, patience, and the hidden depths of human character would continue to shape the community's interactions and understanding. As evening fell over St. Mary Mead, the soft glow of lanterns illuminated quiet streets, the rustle of leaves marking the passage of time. Miss Marple, in her parlour, finished her tea and placed the cup upon its saucer. The village had returned to its outward calm, but the underlying awareness, the understanding of human nature she had quietly nurtured, remained firmly established. And in that gentle quiet, she smiled softly, knowing that the balance of human behavior, observation, and subtle consequence had once again been maintained, the threads of deception unraveled, and the truth quietly restored to its rightful place. In the village she had long observed with such patient insight. The village of St. Mary Mead awoke on a crisp morning, the kind that carried a delicate promise of renewal. Frost glittered on the hedgerows, and the air held the faint scent of wood smoke drifting from chimneys. Life, as it invariably does, began to reassert its rhythm. Shopkeepers opened their doors, children scurried along the cobbled lanes, and the church bells rang with their familiar, comforting cadence. Yet beneath the surface of everyday activity, the subtle memory of recent events lingered like a quiet shadow. Miss Marple, walking along the familiar paths of the village, observed the changes with gentle satisfaction. People moved with renewed care, gestures and glances carrying a faint caution tempered by experience. The revelation of Leonard and Clarissa's culpability had left an indelible mark on the community, yet the village was resilient, shaped by both its traditions and the quiet lessons imparted by the unraveling of human deceit. Lady Whitcomb's estate, now returned to a semblance of order, bore the faint traces of disruption. The household staff had resumed their routines with diligent precision, yet Miss Marple noted a subtle shift in demeanour. There was a quiet attentiveness to behavior, a recognition that even ordinary gestures could carry significance. Mrs. Tebb, in particular, seemed to navigate her duties with a renewed mindfulness, her eyes reflecting an understanding of the delicate balance between appearance and reality. The memorial for Henry Frobisher, though concluded, remained present in the consciousness of the villagers. They spoke of him with both grief and reflection, understanding that the gentle and meticulous observation of Miss Marple had restored truth to their lives. Conversations, once light and frivolous, now carried a weightier tone, tempered by awareness of human complexity and the realization that actions, even small, seemingly inconsequential ones, could ripple through a community in unforeseen ways. Miss Marple herself returned to her quiet routines, the rhythms of daily life offering a canvas upon which she could continue her subtle observations. Her parlour, warm with the soft glow of late morning sunlight, was her sanctuary. Tea in hand, she reflected on the intricacies of human behaviour she had observed. The faint tremor of a hand, the brief hesitation in speech, the imperceptible glance revealing anxiety or guilt. Each small sign, unnoticed by many, had contributed to the understanding and resolution of the case. The constable, for his part, had settled into a measured routine. Though the village's tranquility had been restored, he carried a quiet respect for Miss Marple's methods. Her approach, rooted in psychological observation rather than the procedural reliance on overt evidence, had revealed truths that might have otherwise remained concealed. He noted, with a combination of relief and admiration, that justice had been achieved not through confrontation, but through insight and careful attention to the subtleties of human nature. Among the villagers, life resumed with cautious optimism. Mrs. Abernathy returned to her garden with renewed attention, observing the growth of roses with the meticulous care she had always favored, yet now tempered by the knowledge that appearances could mislead. Conversations in the market were lively once more, yet beneath the humor and chatter there existed a quiet awareness, a shared recognition that Miss Marple's insights had uncovered hidden motives and restored equilibrium to their community. The children, too, learned from the events that had unfolded. While their innocence remained intact, a subtle maturity had emerged. They observed the adults around them with heightened attentiveness, sensing that actions and gestures carried meaning beyond words. Their games continued, yet even in play, there was an awareness that human behavior could be complex, layered, and sometimes deceptive. As the days passed, Miss Marple continued her quiet walks, visiting neighbors, offering counsel when needed, and observing the rhythms of life with her characteristic patience. Each interaction, no matter how ordinary, was an opportunity to witness the interplay of motive, emotion, and consequence. She understood that while Leonard and Clarissa had been held accountable, the lessons imparted by their actions would resonate throughout the village in subtle and enduring ways. On an afternoon visit to the church, Miss Marple paused beneath the high windows, watching sunlight pour onto polished wooden pews. She reflected on the events that had brought the village to this moment of restoration. The careful orchestration of crime, the psychological subtleties she had observed, and the final revelation that had restored truth. The resolution, though quietly achieved, had re-established the moral and social balance that St. Mary Mead depended upon. Even the natural rhythms of the village seemed to acknowledge this restoration. The birds sang with renewed vigor, the trees rustled in a gentle breeze, and the river that wound through the edge of the village shimmered with clarity. Life, in its subtle and persistent way, continued, bearing witness to the quiet triumph of observation, understanding, and the delicate restoration of order. Miss Marple, in the serenity of her own home that evening, contemplated the nature of human behavior. She understood that people were capable of both subtle kindness and carefully concealed malice, and that the balance between these tendencies often defined the course of events. It was through careful attention to these intricacies, through the observation of small gestures, fleeting expressions, and subtle inconsistencies, that the truth could be discerned. In her final reflections, Miss Marple allowed herself a faint smile. The village, though changed, had regained its outward tranquility. The hidden currents of resentment, deception, and ambition had been observed, understood, and gently unraveled. Justice had been served not through force or accusation, but through insight, patience, and the quiet application of human understanding. As twilight descended on St. Mary Mead, the warm glow of lanterns illuminated familiar streets. The villagers moved through their routines with a calm attentiveness, aware of both the fragility and resilience of community life. And in her parlor, Miss Marple, ever composed, sipped her evening tea with quiet satisfaction, reflecting on the enduring lessons of human nature, the power of subtle observation, and the delicate balance between concealment and revelation that defined the lives of those around her. The bells of the church rang softly, their chimes resonating with a sense of closure. For St. Mary Mead, life would continue, ordinary yet enriched by the lessons of truth, perception, and the quiet genius of Miss Marple. And for the detective herself, there remained the unending opportunity to observe, understand, and gently guide the village through the intricate dance of human behavior, ever mindful that even in the calmest of places, the truths beneath the surface were never truly hidden for long. St. Mary Mead had returned to its gentle rhythm, yet beneath the familiar calm lingered the quiet memory of events that had shaken the village. The subtle manipulations, the hidden resentments, and the careful orchestration of deceit had been laid bare, and justice, patient and understated, had quietly prevailed. Miss Marple, seated by her window with a cup of tea warming her hands, watched the villagers go about their day. The children laughed in the gardens, shopkeepers exchanged friendly greetings, and even the hedgerows seemed to shimmer with the clarity that truth brings. Life, in its ordinary grace, continued, but now enriched by lessons in vigilance, understanding, and the intricate subtleties of human nature. She reflected on the delicate balance she had observed, the interplay of pride, ambition, fear, and affection that shapes every choice, every gesture. Leonard and Clarissa had been held accountable, but their story was also a reminder that people are capable of both concealment and revelation, malice and kindness, and that even small, seemingly inconsequential actions can ripple through a community in unforeseen ways. Miss Marple's satisfaction was quiet, yet profound. It was not the thrill of discovery alone that mattered, but the restoration of balance, the gentle unveiling of truth, and the knowledge that human behavior, complex, unpredictable, and endlessly fascinating, could be understood with patience, attentiveness, and care. As the church bells rang once more, their tones carrying through the crisp evening air, the detective allowed herself a faint smile. The village had endured as it always would, guided by subtle observation, shared history, and the enduring awareness that in St. Mary Mead, nothing, no gesture, no glance, no whisper, truly escaped notice. And so, the quiet genius of Miss Marple remained at work, ever watchful, ever understanding, ready to discern the truths that lay beneath the placid surface of everyday life. In the ordinary rhythm of the village, life went on, but the lessons of the past lingered as enduring as the chime of the bells that had once rang after death.